my name is Rachel Johnson, and I'm going to be presenting some research that I got the chance to work on in a course called Race and American Literature on Herman Melville's novella Benito, Cerano. So I've written an essay titled The Significance of Silence and the Struggle for Agency in Benito, Cerano, and I'm going to read that for you guys today. Looking comparatively between the white and black characters within Herman Melville's novella Benito, Cerano, the reader is confronted with the character's struggle for control and agency. There are many scenes that display Captain Delano's understanding of who holds the power that conflicts with the actual reality of the situation at hand. The enslaved blacks have overcome the ship's leaders. While this information is not revealed to the reader until late in the action of the novella, the reader benefits from reflecting on the hidden truth of the novella to understand its implications on power dynamics and race. Through analyzing how the characters interact with each other upon this reflection, the reader is given insight into how the novella comments on race relations and the desire for personal agency. Silence plays an important role in the black character's attempts at having control or agency against the system of slavery. Babo, Atufal, and the unnamed black women aboard the San Dominick exist within Melville's novella as strikingly silent characters. Scholars like Hagart, Sundquist, and Goldberg have noted this silence within the novella in analysis of the piece as a work of fiction that provides real-world commentary. This paper aspires to analyze Melville's presentation of the black and white characters that participate in a struggle for agency that is being revealed through their silences. Although the default understanding of silence revolves around its lacking in substance, the reader benefits from recognizing the power and significance of the silences within the novella in relation to the character's agency or lack of it. After reading the account of what has happened on the San Dominick, mainly through Amasa Delano's perspective, what requires discussion here is who, in his mind, has the power and is in control. Delano boards the ship and acts in accordance with a single-minded notion that the African characters in his story exist as passive recipients of the choices of white characters incapable of their own moral choices. His singular mindset, naivete, or unwillingness to entertain certain feelings of suspicion make him vulnerable to deception, so that his outlook on the situation aboard the ship is manipulated by his own bias as well as by other characters working actively to manipulate his perception. Traditionally throughout history, white dominance has been legitimized by making it ostensibly normal and neutral, which is an idea that Delano seems to agree with. He frequently overlooks silences or attributes them to something other than what they are, according to the fact of white dominance and black subservience. The reader experiences much of the work as a whole through Delano's perspective, causing the reader to be placed into the mindset of the innocent, observing captain. The reader is forced to experience the narrative puzzle of Melville's work alongside Delano, so that the reader is in the same innocent, observing mindset in their first confused reading, as Delano is as he moves through the events of the novella. Not only does the confusion of the novella's narrative make the reader uncomfortable, but it acts as a driving factor due to the reader's desire for truth within the story. Melville chose as his subject not a series of known events, but a text that already exposed the divergence between history as it occurred and the writing that later recorded it. Melville's novella is a retelling of events based around Delano's retelling of actual events. The piece is twice removed from the actual reality of the situation, so it is important for the reader to recognize that the story does not have all the answers and insight into the actual event that occurred. That is to say, there are answers that Melville and Delano cannot provide. As retellings of the actual events, both texts cannot reveal the true nature of what happened due to the omission or obscuring of the black characters' experiences and perspectives. Melville writes these characters' silences, a contradictory task, for the reader to pay attention. The overall narrative proceeds, that is to say, by seeming to speak and explain, but in fact withholding. The whole story is not and cannot be told, forcing the reader into the position of examining the story despite its mysterious or deceptive nature upon the first reading. The reader is then able to examine events that in retrospect seem to illuminate many of his plot's most disturbing enigma, upon reflective analysis of the text. As a reflective analysis, Melville's novella is put under a continuous review in this paper in an effort to understand the significance of silence and power dynamics while recognizing the restrictions of narrative and the whitewashed history the reader has to work with. Melville confronts the challenge of writing silences among his black characters to present the text in such a way that requires attention and careful, close reading. Towards the end of the story, Babo takes a stance of powerful silence as he does not speak a word after his capture, meeting his execution with a voiceless end. He could have been motivated by his desire not to provide any more information about his identity, his thoughts, or feelings. He may not believe he owes an account of the events to white men who will act upon the same biases that Delano acted upon, viewing them as incapable creatures. He knows this testimony will not change his punishment and would likely not be believed at all. If it were to be believed, however, it might have negatively affected his fellow black slave. Much like Frederick Douglass's narrative, which omits details on how he escaped slavery, Babo could be working to protect the other revolters, better positioning them to succeed after his execution. Another take is that if Babo had spoken at the end, his words could have been perceived as remorseful. His silence confirms his certainty and confidence in his choices. Regardless of his intention, Babo's muteness is not an absence upon which his testimony could or should be inscribed. Rather, his muteness is his testimony. Babo's silence is not an absence, but an overwhelming presence in the novella. An enslaved person's words would not have been met with open ears at the time, even if words were to be spoken, so it is better that he chose to fall into silence. Babo becomes the sole authority over his own lived experience through exhibiting a silence or refusal to speak and act that both expresses and withholds authority by keeping it poised for possible implementation. He maintains authority over his own life and simultaneously rejects the authority imposed upon him by Don Benito in the judicial system. His silence calls for justice, unlike what he gets when his head is placed on a pole, met unabashed by the gaze of the whites. His mute testimony speaks to the issue of how justice has been served and how history has been told. That is, without the recognition of black truth. Not only is he silent in the final portion of the narrative, Babo's voice is only transcribed when he is in character as Cerano's servant. Babo never actually speaks as his true self within the text, making his experience and perspective completely silent or lacking in speech to Delano and the reader. The reader must keep in mind the silence throughout the novella among not only Babo but all the black characters. Babo's right hand, Atufal, for example, is a silent presence upon the San Dominic. Atufal is a large, physically capable man that Babo works with to overtake the ship, and he is presented to Delano and the reader as a purported mutineer brought before Don Benito to beg his pardon for some unspecified infraction. Delano views him as he stood in unfailing muteness before Don Benito. From his first introduction to Delano, Atufal is a menacing, silent presence that acknowledges the possibility of uprising among the blacks. Through that acknowledgement and Don Benito's ability to pardon him at any moment, Delano is provided with reassurance of the order upon the ship, an order that places Atufal's mute subservience at the forefront of Delano's perception. Through this reassurance, Babo and Melville recognize the lasting paranoia among slaveholders regarding the possibility of slave unrest. Babo is able to orchestrate the presence of Atufal in chains so that he plays off of Delano's preconceptions of white supremacy and black subservience. Later in the novella, Delano still sees the chained Negro Atufal standing quietly there again, remaining as a reassuring yet intimidating presence that corresponds with Delano's bias. Babo utilizes silence in himself and in Atufal in order to manipulate Delano's racially biased naivete so that silence is not simply silence. Silence is a physical presence throughout the novella that the black characters exist in. Importantly, the black women aboard the San Dominic are also silently present forces that Delano observes. Walking afoot the ship, Delano encounters the sight of a negress holding a babe to her breast that he views. Like most uncivilized women, they seemed at once tender of heart and tough of constitution, equally ready to die for their infants or fight for them. Viewing the women with a self-congratulating humaneness, he is written as admiring the naked nature of the mother and child in such a way that his racial bias shines through his observations as he uses animalistic language to describe the pair, and he never thinks of the specific struggle an enslaved black woman might have to experience. In Delano's narrative, that the text is based on, he is largely concerned with how Don Benito treats him after the ship has been retaken and the revolters captured, recognizing the fact that Don Benito's repeatedly treated him with ingratitude, injustice, or want of compassion. Ironically, Delano is not at all concerned with how other people, specifically black people, are treated in similar ways. That is, without gratitude, justice, or compassion. These women aboard the San Dominick are treated in this way through how Delano perceives them. It is not until later in the novella that the women are acknowledged again, and the character of Delano and the reader is given the truth of the women's role in the plot. Melville writes on the active role they had in taking over their ship. The negresses of age were knowing to the revolt and testified themselves satisfied at the death of their master, Don Alexandro. The women were active participants that sang songs and danced during the uprising. In fact, they exhibit a brutality surpassing that of the men. The violence in the black women suggests they had special grounds for rage and revenge against the men who had enslaved them, as Melville's use of the term of age emphasizes the presence of sexual violence. As previously examined, Delano does not seem overly concerned with the treatment of the women on the ship. He displays no compassion and disregards their agency by simply viewing them as tender mothers. He would never have imagined that the woman's utmost influence was used to encourage violence towards their masters. Melville's novella pushes to present these women with silent agency within the world of the text. In this way, Melville discusses the unique sexual injustices and mistreatments they underwent, presenting the woman with extensive motivation for revenge. Other silences throughout the novella include situations in which Delano, Don Benito, and Babo are together with different variations of silence. Most notably is the scene of Babo shaving Don Benito's face. The reader can understand why Delano is so conflicted and confused at the situation on the ship. Melville provides the repeated image of Benito's anxiety at being in the hands of Babo here, as he nervously shuddered and again faintly shuddered. For Delano and the reader, there seems to be no reason for Don Benito's anxiety, since Babo is the most trusted servant, but he is afraid. The play of the barber compresses Delano's blind innocence, Cerano's spiritual fright, and Babo's extraordinary mastery of the scene's props and actors into a nightmare pantomime symbolic of the revenge of New World slaves upon their debilitated masters. Perhaps Don Benito is failing at the part he is supposed to play by revealing this fear, but Delano is confused by his actions. Even though he does not completely recognize his behavior as sprouting from fear at first, after Don Benito's shaking causes Babo to cut him, producing a terrified aspect in Don Benito, Delano chooses to leave the room. Upon leaving, a noise urges him to look back and see Babo with a hand to his cheek and providing a wailing soliloquy that enlightens him to what happened. The key here is the fact that Babo is the one revealing how the events unfolded. Babo creates the illusion that Don Benito has power rather than himself through the grotesque exhilaration that the shaving scene provides for those viewing it. It is an overt expression of the taut relationship between Babo and Don Benito that the reader and Delano do not have a full understanding of the situation's implications on who holds the power. Delano's belief that black people are incapable of such elaborate actions as overtaking a ship influences his perception on Don Benito and Babo's relationship. This is simply one scene of many within the novella that draws on the relationship between the master and the servant, displaying the importance of control and power. Don Benito has to play his role well, since Babo has the power, and his shuddering, silent demeanor exemplifies his lack of agency in the current status of the ship. The silences in the story are where the truth is hidden during the cast of characters' struggle for agency and power. When lacking agency, Don Benito often is unable to provide speech, leaving the air empty of words but ripe with meaning. Throughout the narrative, Don Benito attempts to attempts in many cases to convey his meaning without words in such a way that Delano and the reader must decipher his intended meaning. One example of this occurs when Delano and Don Benito are parting ways. As Delano is walking to leave the ship, Don Benito repeatedly extends a farewell. When the two captains met, the Spaniard again fervently took the hand of the American, at the same time casting an earnest glance into his eyes, but as before, too much overcome to speak. In this moment, the register of muteness is overwhelming, as it confuses Delano's understanding of the situation and Don Benito himself. Don Benito tries to present his distressed, dire situation through his extended hand and earnest eye contact, but as usual, Delano remains clueless. Even while the text spills with suggestions of rebellion, Delano and the reader are still held in a state of confused innocence watching the events unfold. Don Benito's silence is reaching out to Delano for help from the black revolters. Delano does not perceive Don Benito's lack of agency due to his race. The idea that the blacks could revolt and take control over the white passengers never even crosses his mind. Don Benito's silence represents his lack of agency, but Babo frequently utilizes silence as a way to maintain or obtain agency. Prior to the scene of the two captains' farewells, Babo appears to act as a comforting servant from Delano's perspective, but the reader can recognize the hidden meaning in the silence of the moment. He spoke no word, he only rested his eye on his master's as if, amid all Don Benito's distress, a little to refresh his spirit by the silent sight of fidelity. This is a passage that directly refers to Babo's silence as power, as he is able to present himself in a nature of fidelity while conveying his dominance over Don Benito through their eye contact. Rather than Babo's eye contact with Don Benito representing his submission, it represents his control over the man and the ship. Babo and the other black characters' silence emphasize their agency and their need to act against injustice throughout the novella. While the black characters take control of the ship and their place on it, Don Benito and his fellow Spaniards are forced into submission, a role Delano views as innately meant for black people. Delano details the docility and incapabilities of the black slaves upon the San Dominick without recognition of the real situation. This in itself is an injustice towards the black characters, as Melville's text may be understood to represent justice's perversion as an archive of silence empty of the content it is expected to hold. Delano does not have an accurate understanding of the events that occurred on the San Dominick due to his biased perception of race relations as hierarchical. Melville provides the silences in the novella as a mirror of the silences of historical representation for black people, like Babo and the others. Babo's silent end to death allows him to act as a martyr for his race. He seeks agency in death due to how his silence reflects the unjust nature of history and the judicial process. The system of slavery is something that Babo can never accept, and his silence presents a refusal to accept it as well as a desire to advocate against how he and his fellow slaves upon the ship were treated. Melville utilizes these sentiments in his depiction of black silence to contradict the system of slavery and advocate for black people beyond the world of the novella. Thank you.